Hello and welcome to the Single Stroke 7 course from Practice Drumming. First, let's go over the rhythmic structure of a Single Stroke 7. It is extremely simple, and just like the name sounds, it is just 7 alternating notes. Right? To start, you have this sextuplet, and then to end it, you have a quarter note. So the sextuplet takes up one full beat, and the quarter note takes up another, right? So in this measure right here, we would end up with 4 beats. We'd have beat 1, beat 2, beat 3, and beat 4. So let's take a listen before we go any further. All right, what are you seeing? Because what I'm seeing is, again, we are just alternating, right? We're just going back and forth between our right and left hands. It's almost like an extension of the single stroke roll, but we've just capped it, right? We've put a beginning and an end on it. So here's how we have set this up to make this a little easier for you. First off, I think it's important for you to start by repeating one side several times. So you'll notice in this first exercise here, we're actually repeating each side 4 times, and we're starting relatively slowly, right, at 50 BPM. Let's take a listen to that first. Here's the third time, and the last time, switch over. So we've recorded that at 50, at 60 BPM, and at 70 BPM here. Once you get comfortable with doing 4 times on each side, then you can switch over to doing 1 time on each side. Now, is it a crime if you wanted to start off with just doing the 1 time on each side? Not necessarily, but this transition is really what we're working on here, because if you've already mastered the single stroke roll, or I should say if you feel comfortable with it, this is not inherently going to be difficult because the sticking is so simple, right? We've already talked about that. The sticking is essentially just a single stroke roll. Really what you're practicing is segmenting that single stroke roll into 7 beats and then making this transition over, right? So I would still advise that you practice the 4 times before you move on to the 1 time on each side. Lastly, let's talk about technique real quick. I'm just going to scrub through here, and one of the things that you will notice is that as I'm playing, each of these strokes is a really full wrist movement. So I'm actually, let's pause right here. Let's take a look at this. See how far up this has gone here, right? I'm not ending with my wrist or my stick, down here. We're going all the way up here, right? So why do I do that? Why are we playing this at such a full stroke? Well, there's a good reason for that. Because we really want to capture the rebound, right? We don't want to dead stop the sticks, because as you move faster, what's inherently going to happen is you're not going to be able to go up this high. You're just going to have to come down this low. And if you're dead stopping your sticks when you get down here, you're not going to be utilizing the rebound to bring you back up and then be able to push back down off of that rebound. So really full rebounded strokes, very important. And that said, you can still practice at varying dynamics. I'm not saying you have to do everything super loud. Just because you're pulling the sticks far back doesn't mean that you are coming down with full force, right? You can still come down with an appropriate amount of touch onto the drum. Now, I'm also using German grip here. So if you look, my hands are flat, right? My palms are facing down. That's not the only way to do this. You're more than welcome to practice in French grip if you want. If you're not familiar with that, no problem, use German. Last but not least, I would also say make sure that you are sitting straight up. This is just a general rule for life, but something that's always good to have a reminder for. All right, as a recap, you have 4 times on each side to start with. You're going to start by playing 4 times on each side at 50, 60, and 70. And then you're going to move on to playing one time on each side at 50, 60, and 70. Good luck. Let's move on to playing the single stroke 7 with a pulsed kick note. Let's take a listen first. Let's talk about the rhythmic structure, because what I'm seeing is that nothing has changed with the hands, right? I'm still just playing 7 notes, either starting with the right hand or starting with the left hand. The only thing that's really changed is we now have a kick note here, 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 and here, just to bookend the single stroke 7. So one other thing I'm noticing here is that I have 4 of these kicks, right? So that means that these kicks are actually just coming on the downbeat. So very simple rhythmic structure. Again, haven't changed anything with the hands, just pulsing a kick on 1, 2, 3, and 4. All right, since this is so simple, I do just want to very quickly talk about a little bit of technique here. Whenever you have unison notes like this, I always like to remind people to be very conscious that you don't flam them. You don't want your snare to be right before your kick, or vice versa, your kick to be right before your snare. You want these to be at the exact same time, right? So even though the exercise conceptually is very simple, I want you then to use that brain power to think about making sure that these notes happen at the exact same time. Another few things for you just to think about mentally here. First off, whenever you play this first kick, it's going to be with your right hand. And if you start with your right hand, that means you're also going to end with your right hand here. Same thing, vice versa, right? If you start with your left hand, you are also going to end with your left hand. And that's another way that you'll know, especially as you speed up, that you're getting this correct. So not a huge transition from our last exercise, but the reason that we are getting the foot in here is to make this more of a drum set exercise, so that as we start moving it to the hi-hat or moving it to the ride cymbal or going around the toms, we feel a little more comfortable. We're just getting one more limb involved. So use this time to focus on getting those beautiful unison notes and refining your single stroke 7. This exercise will be at 40, 50, and 60. Good luck. Okay, let's get to the part that everyone wants, which is how do you add a single stroke 7 into a drum beat or a fill? This lesson is going to be on the drum beats. So before we go any further, let's just take a listen. Here's beat number 1 at 100. All right, let's take a listen to beat 2 at 100. Very similar, but a little different. So for these next 2 lessons, I'm going to show you some very practical ways that you can add the single stroke 7 into 2 beats and 2 fills that sounds very organic. It doesn't sound too rudiment based. And these applications of the single stroke 7 are meant for beginner drummers, and they're supposed to be simple and easy to memorize, and also give you ways to understand how to apply what is seemingly a very dry snare drum exercise to the drum set and add a lot of flavor. So let's break this beat down and let's go back to beat 1 here to start. So this beat really comprises of 2 parts. First is this 8th note rock beat, and then this hi-hat lick with like a little turnaround. So I'm assuming that you already have a basic rock beat down, but let's just talk about the kick and snare parts here, because the kick is just coming on 1, 3, and the and of 3, right? So 1, 3, and of 3. And the snare is coming on 2 and 4. So you're just going like 1, 2, 3, and 4, right? Fairly simple beat. So that really is the basis of this beat, that kick and snare pattern. And where the flavor really comes in is this hi-hat lick right here. So let's talk about how that works. To start, let's actually isolate it. And let's take a listen to just that hi-hat lick isolated. So what I'm seeing here is that my right hand is up on the hi-hat as well as my left hand, right? So both of my hands are on the hi-hat here, and we're just playing a single stroke 7 on the hi-hat. Where things really get interesting is after we play that single stroke 7, the right hand is going to come down to the snare. So look right here, right? The right hand is going to come down, play that snare notes, and then pop right back up to the hi-hat for that final ending note right here. So what's kind of cool about this is normally if you're playing just a regular 8th note rock beat, the left hand is playing this snare note on 2 and on 4. So to the listener, it really feels the same. But because we're able to add in this little bit of flavor, this single stroke 7 here, which actually the first 6 notes are on the hi-hat and the last one's on the snare, we're able to bring some nuance into our playing. So again, we isolated this because moving your left hand up to the hi-hat like this can be a little new, but it's nothing crazy. Let's take a look at this in context here. We're going to listen a little slower just to start. So this is beat 1 at 60 BPM. So let's break this down. Again, our right hand is staying on the hi-hat to start, right? And we're playing this basic rock beat. But right here, you're going to notice the left hand, it's starting to come up, right? Because we're getting ready to play this single stroke 7 here. So we play the single stroke 7, boom, boom, boom. Right hand is now going to come to the snare. After the right hand plays the snare, it's going to pop back up to the hi-hat and we're going to reset, right? So notice that now my hands are in the position that they started in. Let's go over that one more time. Basic rock beat, right? 1 and 2 and okay, now we're here at single stroke 7, right? Left hand is coming up here so we can play the single stroke 7 on the hi-hat. We play that single stroke 7, boom, boom, boom. Right hand comes down to the snare to play beat 4 right here. Boom, plays beat 4, and then pops right back up to reset us into the same position that we started in. Now, while this might sound like a lot, I think that this is a great way as a beginner to get used to getting out of your normal just right hand crossed over the left hand position and do something that really is almost just a snare exercise that now we've moved to the hi-hat, but it sounds great, right? When you hear it in context, especially a little quicker, it sounds pretty fancy, but it's just 7 alternating notes. That's all it is, and ending on the snare. All right, if we're feeling comfortable with that, let's apply this same idea to beat 2, and let's look at how it's constructed. First, let's listen to it a little slower. We're going to listen to it at 60 BPM so your ear can start to dissect what's going on here. want to tell you what I'm noticing immediately. I'm seeing the same eighth note rock beat I had before, but the only difference is instead of playing it on the hi-hat, I'm over here on the ride. So I just went from like a closed position to an open position here. Here's something else that I'm noticing. I'm noticing that we're seeing different cymbal notes here. So just to go over that real quick, whenever we see an X that's on the line, at least for our notation here, practice drumming, that's going to be a ride cymbal. And whenever we see an X just above the staff, that's going to be a hi-hat. So really all we've done here is added in this single stroke 7 with the exact same sticking, right? We're just alternating, starting with our right hand. But instead of it all being on the hi-hat, we are splitting it up between the ride and the hi-hat, ending it the same just as we did before with the right hand on the snare. With that in mind, just take a listen one more time. We're going to listen at 60 and then we're going to speed it up a little bit. We're going to listen at 100 so you can hear how that sounds. All right, let's take a listen at 100 now. So again, same beat, but just sped up. And this is where the magic really happens because it sounds very fancy, but it's just a single stroke 7 alternating between the ride and the hi-hat. Here we go. So here's how we recommend starting with this. First, starting with the isolated version, right? Where you're just practicing doing this single stroke 7 only on the hi-hat and then getting that transition with the right hand down to the snare and then resetting back on the hi-hat. Like before when we were doing 4 times and 1 times through, is it required to do this? No, not necessarily, but it's going to help you make that transition with your left hand, especially if you're not immediately comfortable with that. It's going to help you make that transition from the snare drum over here onto the hi-hat. Once you've mastered that, then you can move on to this full beat, right? You can move on to playing the rock beat before and then getting that single stroke 7 on the hi-hat, ending on the snare. And then once you feel comfortable with that, a really natural progression is to move it over to the ride cymbal. And again, we really haven't changed sticking. We're just changing where we're going, right? Our right hand is now on the ride cymbal instead of on the hi-hats. And then when we get to this section here for the single stroke 7, our right hand stays on the ride cymbal and our left hand moves over here to the hi-hats, and the right hand still just transitions, plays that snare note on 4. One last thing I want to talk about, just that you've probably noticed here, is that all of our tracks have music behind them, which is just to give them a little more feel, make it a little less sterile. It often feels different to play beats like this in a musical context, so we wanted to give this to you in a musical context. All right, good luck, practice hard. We'll see you in the next lesson. Now we're going to go over playing the single stroke 7 in 2 different fills. Before I say anything else, let's take a listen. All right, let's hear fill number 2 now at 100. I hope that you are starting to see a pattern here between the beats that we just learned and the fills that you just heard. Let's dissect this a little bit. First off, we have an 8th note rock beat before. Again, this is just to give you something to practice with. Do you have to do this beat where you play a kick on 1 and a snare on 2? No, not necessarily. This is just a starting point for you, right? But if you start here, it might be a little easier to learn this fill. So let's talk about the fill. Again, it's just a single stroke 7, starting with the right hand. The first 3 beats are going to be on the floor tom. The next 3 beats are going to be on the snare drum. And what this does is make a really nice build. We're starting with this really low sounding floor and moving to this very sharp sounding snare, which drives into the fill. After we do that, we tap the snare on beat 4 and then end with a kick to turn us around. Let's take a listen at 60, just so that your ear can dissect that a little more. So let's talk about this sticking real quick. One of the things you'll notice as we scroll through here, both hands move over to the floor tom. You do 3 notes on the floor tom, and what's the last note you do on the floor tom? It's a right here. And why that's so nice is that it opens up the left hand to really nicely start on the snare here, right? It's a very organic transition. Get 3 more notes on the snare, and then end it on the snare with this final right. And then this final kick really leaves both of our hands open. Let's scroll through to that point. It leaves both of our hands open, right? So, and boom, kick note comes down right here. Leaves both of our hands open to transition back into this crossed position to get back into our rock beat, which, like I said at the beginning, you don't necessarily have to start with, but it's often nice to end a fill with a kick like this so that wherever your hands need to go, they have the time and space to be able to do it. Let's go over fill 2 and let's listen to it at 60 BPM. Again, it's very similar, just one small alteration. Here we go. Here is what I am seeing with this fill. The only difference is that instead of starting it on the floor tom, we are starting it on the rack tom. This is also a good point to say it doesn't necessarily have to be a middle rack tom like we have here. It could be a high tom. It really doesn't matter as long as you are doing some type of movement, and this high tom just brings in a little different flavor than this floor tom does. All right, before we end this course, I just want to say a couple last things. First, make sure that as you are playing this kick note, you don't rush this kick note getting back into the top of the beat. It can be very exciting to play this really fast lick here on the toms and the snare, and then rush this kick note here as you're moving in to the beginning of the beat here. Just be conscious to play this as 2 even 8th notes and don't rush it. Finally, when you do get to the top of the beat, again, like we talked about when you added the single stroke 7 with a kick, that these 2 notes here are in unison. It is very, very easy to flam these 2 notes, and that's not what we want. We want this hi-hat or whatever it is to be at the same time as this kick right here. That brings us to the end of this course. Thank you so much for taking the time to learn with us. I really hope that you have taken two things in particular away from this course. One is that practicing is what gets you the results, hence why we have recorded all of these different beats and fills and hand exercises at multiple speeds that we want you to play along with. And number two, rudiments really aren't as complex as they seem, and really simple drum set applications can add a huge amount of flavor to your playing. I hope you've learned something from this course. We have all 40 rudiments available in this format. My name is Lane Parsons, and I hope that you have a wonderful day.